Shall we start? Yep. Okay. Cool. So, hello. Welcome to the last session in this track. I'm David Wormold. I work for MarkLogic, and we're sponsoring this track session. And for those of you who've heard that 3 times before this, I apologise. That's the last time you'll hear it today. It's my pleasure, though, as a sponsor of the track session, to introduce the speakers who are speaking today. And the final speaker on this track is Charlie Betz. Charles is the chief architect with the signature client group of AT&T, responsible for AT&T's technical strategy with Fortune 100 clients in the upper Midwest. He's well-known enterprise architect, author, and researcher in the field of IT management with experience at Target, Wells Fargo, Accenture, and Best Buy. He is currently teaching graduate-level IT management classes at the University of St. Thomas. Charlie has served as an ITIL reviewer and COBIT author and is now a member of the IT4IT strategy board, which is leading a new industry reference model for the business of IT. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you. Great. Thanks much. Good to see you all. This is the second time I've done an IT4IT presentation. My presentations are always a matter of continuous improvement. It's currently a little text-heavy, a little wordy. I'm eventually going to turn it into a presentation which is nothing but large pictures of cats in a single word. But we're a ways away from getting to that presentation nirvana, so please forgive me if the slides are a little busy. But it will be content-rich, and at least will be the kind of presentation you can look at after the fact and glean some meaning from, rather than just that cats are cute. So we already talked about this, so that's done. Check that one off. I'm going to cover, first of all, why. Why do you care? Why is this important? And I've been warned I need to stay this side of the screen. I tend to pace. I like to pace up and down, but we're being filmed, so I have to behave myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about the IT4IT standard positioning, its governance model, and the Agile workstream, which I am currently leading in IT4IT, and also then how to get involved and why you might want to do so. So in preparing for this presentation, I was able to go back to some much older presentations that I was giving in the 2004 to 2006 time frame. Around about 2003, when I was actually at Best Buy, I was trying to make sense of why on earth I was building a metadata repository and what it meant in a broader context. And I had an encounter with a senior executive who I told him, he asked me, what do I do? And I said, I run the metadata management office. And he said, boy, that sounds like a business that we shouldn't be in. And it was a little demoralizing, but it was also, I think, a good moment for me in terms of a teachable moment. And I was reading and continuing to look at the trade press, and I came across this guy who's now retired. And he had this quote, which I think is still has provoked, it's been out there as a provocation to the industry now for over 10 years. And there still is a lot of discussion and a lot of interest about this central problem of how do we manage IT better. We're in IT organizations that can range in the Fortune 500. You know, you see them starting in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and you see them topping out $5, $6, $7, $8 billion a year. I mean, that's real money even by congressional standards. And yet the typical situation in so many IT organizations is that they're run on spreadsheets and emails. The subtitle of my book is The Cobbler's Barefoot Children, and this, I think, still largely remains true, that by the time you are at a $6 to $7 billion, if you were a company of $6 to $7 billion, you would have advanced analytics, you would have significant investments in business intelligence and supply chain optimization, you would understand your markets. You don't get to be that big without doing all these things, and yet in IT, if you consider it as a business within the business, it does not engage in the same kinds of practices that you would expect of a set of economic activity of that size. So where does this leave us in IT management? We've had a number of trends, a number of cycles. We've had things like CMM, we've had ITIL, we've had now we've got the Agile movement. I still think that there is some basic almost blocking and tackling maturation that needs to happen, and that's what the IT4IT work, I think, continues to contribute to, or is contributing to. If you go into a data center and you say, why is this server there? How often can you answer that question? I've done this experiment a number of times. At this point, how many of you work in large IT environments, or if you're a consultant, think about the last big IT shop you're in. How many of you have a complete application or service inventory? Okay. How many of you have mapped that service inventory to your IT infrastructure? So you understand, if you go into the data center, in general, and I'm just going to chalk some of this up to Minnesota shyness and this being the after lunch session, because I've seen, in general, an improving set of responses to those questions, and yet we still oftentimes we just don't have just even the basic accountability of what these IT assets are doing. I mean, fully loaded compact Dell 580. I mean, that's not a trivial piece of hardware. Buy a BMW for that kind of money, I believe. Not that I've been in the procurement side of things lately. And I think it still remains a set of questions that in so many IT organizations are not being answered very well. How do my business strategies translate to the IT portfolio? What is the current status of my investments? Not just things that I'm building greenfield, but things that I stood up for X millions of dollars 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm continuing to spend $500,000 a year on. How do I quantify and understand those investments in terms of their value to the business, in terms of their risk, in terms of their top-line contribution, their bottom-line costs? There are other drivers. I mean, we often focus on the projects, but what about the steady state drivers of operational costs, the technology refreshes, the asset refreshes? And how does all this stuff stitch together? What happens? I mean, you have the classic situation where you just need a simple little patch at the application level, and then you realize that simple little patch only applies to the 64-bit version, so it's actually now a significant read apply. And oh, by the way, the legacy servers are still 32-bit, and the new standard for 64-bit coolers, we actually wanted to go to DC-powered and water-cooled, and pretty soon you're talking about a new wing of the data center just because you wanted to patch the application here. Or Larry Ellison wants a new yacht, and so Oracle 9 is going to go off support. And what are the implications of that? Do you have a rough order of magnitude sizing of that technology refresh-driven demand, which, as we all know, the business just loves it when you come to them with technology demand that they had no hand in. And they just love to hear about the fact that there's a new shiny Oracle database that's going to do the exact same thing that the old one did, but they have no choice but to buy it. So, and at the very least, we can't promise a silver bullet to getting out of that question, but a little more visibility is A, possible, and B, I think highly advisable. And then it gets into the supplier perspective. There's a little redundancy here on the slide here, but what are some of the biggest exposures? Software licensing risk. I'll say one word. I'm not gonna say anything more. 9-figure true up, and I'm not talking decimal points. Can happen. That's risk. If you don't know what you're doing. Who am I spending my money with? What talent concerns? How about those mainframe programmers, the market outlook for mainframe programmers over the next 10 years? I'm just going to, that's my retirement plan. I never did anything on the mainframe, but I figure in 10 years I can probably go, take a 6-month mainframe course and hire myself out as a grizzled old mainframer, and that'll be my retirement plan. So, what is the status? How do I understand the dependencies on what I'm building, what I'm doing? All of this stuff. I mean, some of these are some slides I put together years ago, and yet they're still highly relevant. We still don't answer these questions that well. How am I spending the dollars? That second bullet is perhaps I think the most important question, and this is the most important insight of the lean, agile, and DevOps people, is their focus on queues. We'll talk a little bit about that. I think that's definitely a hot topic. Am I using my staff resource effectively? Have I got people responding to multiple unmanaged queues that are prioritized by who screams loudest? If I've got a chief systems engineer and they're supposed to be 25% on projects, but they also get tickets, and then they get all the work that's smaller than a ticket, but smaller than a project, but bigger than a ticket. How do they prioritize that work? It's just not. Here we have the Wi-Fi thing again. It's just generally we don't have a concept of execution at the heart of the IT capability, and I think that does get back to the core of what we meant, what I have been driving for with ERP for IT. I was very naive about ERP for IT when I started thinking about it. I used to think that if we just had a nice big meta model, a nice big data model, and stuck it in a database, put all the IT data in it, then magic would somehow happen. But of course, that's not how the ERP systems emerged. They emerged from a real concept of demand planning, materials, resource planning, and an actual concept of execution and how supply and demand are meeting each other in an optimal sense. And we still are a long ways away from that operational concept in IT, and I think we've gone down some roads that actually have taken us further away from getting to that. And that is almost a set of lectures in and of itself. So that's been my set of concerns for probably the last 10 years. I've been very interested, very focused on it, very focused on this particular domain. And it's been a very interesting journey. About a year and a half ago, I got a call from a person of the Dutch persuasion named Karl van Seeland. And Karl said, "Hi, Charlie, I'm the chief architect for the business of IT for Shell. We have your book, and I'd like to talk." And of course, I was chief architect for the business of IT for Wells Fargo, so I said, "Okay, Karl, nice to meet you. Not too many of us have that particular T-shirt. What can I do for you?" And he said, "Well, so you obviously have had some frustrations. You wrote a book. Very nice book. In the Netherlands, we are more pragmatic. We have gone to HP and told them to fix this." And HP ponied up some real money and put a CTO on this. And Shell also said, "Well, it's not good enough that this just be HP intellectual property. We want this to be an open standard, and we'd like you to be on the strategy board." So I was co-opted to the strategy board. It's been a great journey. About 6 months afterward, we started to have the conversation of, well, which open standards organization? We talked to a number of potential candidates and ultimately had some very fruitful discussions with Alan. Well, everybody recognizes Alan because he spoke this morning, with the Open Group. And it's been a great journey and amazing. If they say, "Oh, standards take forever," I mean, basically it took a year to stand up the forum, which is like nothing. That's light speed. So sometimes when the moment is ripe, I think that standards actually can move quite quickly, and we're looking forward to the first release of the snapshot. The intention, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but the intention of this all is, and I'll go into it more detail, so I don't want to hammer through all of these bullet points here, but essentially it is a reference architecture for the business of IT, and as a benchmark, kind of informal benchmark, you can think of something like ETOM, which I suspect many of you are familiar with, or the Association for Retail Technology Standards, which others of you may be familiar with. And the existence of those models to me is encouraging because it also indicates to me that there is a market and a business model for something like this. It has been done before in other domains, so why can't we do it in this domain? So that is, I think, some sound evidence. Why? Here's some of the basics of it. I think the key point here is that you just wind up reinventing. I had to invent this for a major bank. I had to also at least start considering these issues at a very proto level at one retailer. My friend Carl at Shell, of course, had to reinvent the same thing. He had the benefit of my book, but it was still a lot of work to actually figure out the interfaces. And this is a conversation I've had with chief architects and senior architects in many, many large companies. And we started a LinkedIn group specifically to this set of concerns, attracted hundreds of members without much effort. There are consultants who are in this space, and certainly at scale, you wind up with this question of, how do we run the business of IT? How do we understand it from an architectural perspective? So without further ado, here is the high-level view of the IT for IT reference architecture. It is I think the value chain, it's one thing to say, well, let's have an IT value chain. I put an IT value chain in my book. A lot of people have put out IT value chains. But the trouble with just a high-level IT value chain is what next? What does it really mean? Okay, stuff is going in, stuff, value is coming out. It doesn't really help you as a management construct. I was really excited, and in fact, I'm a little jealous because I wish I had invented this concept of their value streams. They proposed 4 value streams: strategy to portfolio, requirement to deploy, request to fulfill, and detect to correct. And then there's a number of supporting activities that are yet to be elaborated, so there's lots of work there to be done yet if you're interested. But as I looked at it, and I just thought about it, it's like, okay, these value streams really make sense, and they are a logical next level of capability decomposition. They are framed in the standard, high-level process vernacular. We've all seen it: hire to retire, idea to cash, quote to cash, procure to pay. I mean, this is a standard way of characterizing large life cycle processes. Well, here we have them in IT, and they have reasonable cohesiveness. Obviously, there's a lot of interplay between them. DevOps would certainly say that requirement, deploy, and detect to correct need to be wedded at the hip, but it still is helpful to decompose things because they can be seen as separate domains of concern, and I think that the architecture supports that. And it's been, of course, there's much further depth that the standard has gone into. It's not obviously just one high-level picture of a Porter value chain. HP Consulting has been out, an HP product have been out testing this with multiple customers. I believe that they've had quite a bit of success and quite a bit of uptake. The interesting thing is you're actually starting to see people using IT4IT with a small I somewhat generically. I went out and I Googled IT4IT jobs the other day, and I came up with 2 or 3 hits from people who aren't involved in the consortium at all. So we're starting to see that it's becoming a little bit of a meme, and I think it has the potential to do that much beyond something like ERP for IT, which is that horrible ERP baggage. So here's a little bit further drill down into the basics of the major value streams: plan, demand, policy, select. I mean, you can read it yourself. I think the key thing, of course, to remember, and that the conversation we always have with respect to Agile, is that this is not waterfall. These things all operate somewhat independently of each other. Request to fulfill executes thousands of times because that's the actual service. That's the actual provisioning. Or perhaps, I look at it as even perhaps a that could actually be, the fundamental value stream of the transactional service. So like looking up an employee. But I think it's more traditionally understood as, okay, well, let's, provision people with access, let's provision people with cell phones, let's publish an API, and so the request to fulfill also starts to define some requirements for how you need to think about your requirement to deploy in terms of deploying services that can be delivered via a request to fulfill mechanism, hopefully as automated as possible. And then, of course, your detect to correct, which brings together a whole bunch of things that otherwise might be siloed. It brings together capacity, availability, problem, change, incident, and all the rest, of these ITIL-like processes that, tend to generate little pockets of activity when really there's more of an end-to-end. I mean, we have a situation or a potential situation needing correction. Let's look at that much more holistically. So this is the high-level architecture done in a completely idiosyncratic notation. I will say there is a meta model that I like. It is essentially the same constructs we see. You can see a process construct in the meta model. You can see a functional or capability construct in the meta model. You can see a data construct in the meta model, and you can see a systems concept in the meta model. And most, if not all, of the architecture methods I've looked at have those 4 primitives, and IT4IT has those 4 primitives, and it has the potential to matrix them, understand the relationships. This notation is a little bit idiosyncratic. We're using circles for data objects, and the data objects themselves are somewhat they're kind of in this interesting zone between an artifact and a true entity. And of course, with the architects in the room, we're having lots of conversations about how do we differentiate between the artifact aspect of it versus the true entity. I mean, saying that a change or an offer is a data object is one thing, but saying that a release package is a data object is another thing entirely. So again, further work to be done, but it's at least generative. You can have useful conversations. You can drive helpful understanding of the major systems. The blue boxes essentially they're called functional components. And the functional components, I just think of them as application systems for the business of IT. They're somewhat fine-grained, and they're meant to be the smallest possible increment of functionality that makes sense. One typically does not go out and buy a separate change control and incident control system. Is incident up there? It should be. One typically does not buy a separate change and incident system. Nowadays, you buy an integrated suite, but that's not the point of the architecture. So, and of course, it drills down much further. This is what we call a level 2 representation, still using the idiosyncratic notation, and then beyond that, it actually does get into some archimate, so actual, real, much more familiar-looking architecture. And again, as it's a consortium under open governance, it is up to the members what they want to do and where they want to take this technically. And this is, I think, what's novel about it. Some of the other standards that are out there, are much more closed and proprietary. But this is open and accountable to the consortium, the community of the consortium. We'll talk about that. But here, you're actually seeing the detailed notations, the detailed cardinalities, the detailed flows of how the artifacts are expected to proceed. You have, some I think, important insights, such as the fact that recurring incidents generate problems, and then problems, notice the line from problem to demand, because, of course, problems generate demand. And so you need to close the loop with strategy to portfolio. And this systematically, and so the question would be, if you have, Remedy or HP Service Desk and you're doing problem management, are you, in fact, integrating the problem management system back to your demand management system? Are you integrating the incident management system with your software defect management system? That's a big hot topic in DevOps nowadays. So you can use this as an assessment and start to think about, well, where are we in the maturity of our IT organization? Do we have these interfaces in place? And if not, are we doing that deliberately, or have we just overlooked a possible route to value? So, and this is just one example. I did not feel I would have the time, but obviously there's a similar representations for the other 3 major value streams, and then there's the more detailed discussion of some of the key attributes. We're not getting all the way down into fully attributed huge data model the way that ARTS and ETOM are. I mean, something like ETOM, which I consider kind of a gold standard for reference architectures. There's hundreds of entities and thousands of attributes, and it's going to be a number of years before we get there. But again, it's a platform for developing this material, and I think that's the important thing: is we have created an effective platform that has a business model where we can actually say this is a going concern now. Let's talk a little bit about the positioning. We get a lot of questions. Well, what about ITIL? What about COBIT? Why do we need yet another standard? So this somewhat well, it's not exactly complex, but it takes a little bit of interpretation. This is the diagram that we socialized and used to explain the market space for why we needed IT4IT. And so along the left, you have degree of prescriptiveness. So you look at something like CMMI or ITIL, they specifically say we're not prescriptive. Yeah, and they don't get down to a level where it is possible really to be that prescriptive. They are narrative. There's a lot of checklists. There's a lot of, verbiage about you might want to think about this, you might want to think about that. And you compare and you in contrast that, you look at COBIT. COBIT is actually a little bit more structured, as is TOGAF. TOGAF proposes a logical meta model, so those extend further down where ITIL doesn't have even anything like a logical meta model. And look at some of the other industries. You see things like, okay, at a high level, I would say GAP is, clearly computation independent. I mean, you could put it into some text analytics and maybe draw some insights. But you compare GAP to something like XBRL, which is syntactically precise. Now, of course, all the standards we all know and love, like HTTP and HTML and all the IEEE and W3C stuff, that's all below the line here. So it's not even part of the topic here. But we're talking about business verticals, which is, of course, I didn't explain what the horizontal axis is if it's not self-evident. You have, comparison to something like VCore, which is, again, logical, but EDI tells you very specifically how the data has to be structured. And you look at the standards like ARTS and ETOM, and they go down to that attribute. Now, sure, there's some variability. I mean, EDI gives you extremely specific guidance on message formats, whereas ARTS and ETOM are just great fully attributed data models. But I'm not sure how thoroughly they get down into the messaging, and certainly open to any corrections people want to offer me on this. This is very much a work in progress. But I've shown this diagram now to a number of different audiences, and in general, I think it tells the story. So obviously, very interested in hearing any feedback. But the idea is that IT4IT, takes it from the high end and it gets down. It goes from conceptual to logical. It starts bringing in the key detail where necessary. And we've got line of sight, and it will take years, but eventually, conceivably, if the business case is there, we'll get down to the actual attributes that can enable things like multi-vendor incident management. Or I have EA tool from True, I've got portfolio management tool from HP, and I've got a service desk from BMC. How do these things interoperate? If I've got a heterogeneous vendor infrastructure. And there are other standards that have done this, like the ANSI ISA 95 reference architecture for manufacturing, which talks about execution management. So there's a need and a place for these kinds of standards, and I do believe that there's a gap. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it until somebody talks me off the ledge. So how are we doing on time? We got another like 25 minutes. So a little more detailed comparison on ITIL. You can pull this down and look at it later. I'd be restating some of what I said before, but again, ITIL, great for educating the practitioners in some basic common terminology and what we mean by the business of IT. I think it's more or less authoritative in areas like incident, problem, and change. I think it's been somewhat less successful in areas like IT financial management and security and IT portfolio management. It's not mutually exclusive and comprehensive. They admitted in ITIL version 2 that it was like a set of tectonic plates. It was not built to be a fully MENC, mutually exclusive and comprehensive, rigorous logical architecture. It just wasn't what their intent was, It's great for practice, I'm repeating myself, great for education. But it doesn't have, when you are an architect like I was in the positions I've held, you look at it, and at best, it's a statement of requirements, and the ambiguities really can drive you a little crazy. It's not self-evident exactly how you stitch together a set of systems, and especially when you're dealing with the areas that are less core to it, like portfolio management and architecture and so on and so forth, how it all fits together. So that's the. And of course, the other central thing with ITIL is that it's proprietary. It's owned by the UK government. It's being managed by a joint venture of the UK government and Capita Group called Axelos, and there really is no community input. And this has been a significant ongoing topic of conversation within the IT Service Management Forum about how do we get more input into ITIL, and the answer has always come back, well, you don't have it, and you're not going to have it. And so it's a tremendously influential body of work that it is not accountable to a professional community except through some indirect means of, we'll listen to what you're saying and we'll take it under advisement. So I think it's time that the IT community had its own standard that there is a mechanism for becoming involved in. Open group is a consortium model, so there's some aspect of you have to be an organization to be involved, but it still is it's a known workable model. We'll talk more about it later. One of the key differentiators with IT4IT, and this is a little bit jargony, but a critical point, is that it's non-normative with respect to capabilities. It means we're not actually trying to go out and replace ITIL by saying we believe that there is change management, incident management, problem management, portfolio management. We're leaving that discussion to the side to say, well, we know that there are various representations of capabilities and ways that people run IT. There's the scaled Agile framework. Who's heard about that? Any hand? Anybody? Okay. PMBOK, CMMI, COBIT all have, slightly different angles on how they conceive of an IT process model. ITIL, of course, because of the structure of the UK government publications, doesn't even touch project management. They defer that to something called Prince 2, which in the US, we are the major competitor is PMBOK. IT4IT will be normative with respect to system components and data objects, what we call functional components, and data objects or artifacts. And we want to make sure that underpinning architecture can support a variety of different cases here where people just have different mental models for what it is they're doing. They have different ways of understanding their capabilities, and you'll see that with the DevOps. So here is the governance. Here's the open group is obviously a very well respected standards organization, and you can send me the check later, Alan. But it was clearly as we set out and looked at the different standards organizations, and we looked at things like what is the governance model. There is a very clear and transparent model for how the standard is contributed to and evolved over time. There's a lot of accountability. There's a lot of focus on process. HP contributed a considerable amount of intellectual property, but at this point, HP is one vote of 16. On the IT4IT board. Or in the forum as a whole. I mean, there's not the concept of a board. I believe that a consortium model like this is well proven for this nature of standards work. And if that's always the question, show me that there's a model out there that can sustain itself over time. There aren't that many examples. When you look at Open Group and OMG, and organizations like that. Well, okay, they have a business model. How do they do it? Okay, well, and why would we want to replicate that when, we can take the standard into an organization that makes sense? So we've signed up, and we are launched as a forum, and it's been if I do say so myself, a great journey. So, cheers. Yeah. Here's the current and evolving list of consortium members, and very pleased, that. How did I miss IBM? IBM has joined. Well, it's evolving, and we have European firms, Munich Re and Achmea, significant European players of considerable size. Representation, direct representation of people with that chief architect for business of IT role. My friend Sue Desiderio from PricewaterhouseCoopers, senior executive in the portfolio space there. Interesting, Shell founded it, and British Petroleum quickly joined, and so it's this is all public record. So it's always open. Who's involved in a given forum. Obviously, I think there's a lot of. I'll talk a little bit about why one might join a forum, but I'm going to take a little bit of a detour. I've been privileged to lead the Agile enablement work stream And so we said, well, the last thing we want is for IT just to be reinforcing waterfall practices. Agile is a significant trend. It's not going away. It's just been gaining steam. I have been immersing myself in the Agile world. And one of the incidental points I'd like to make is that blue book there is, I think, the most important book out there right now. Has anybody read Reinertsen? Anybody looking at his stuff? So if you're dealing with Agile folks, and I'll just do a little bit of a side note, Agile has a cultural manifestation. And the cultural manifestation has generational dynamics. You're an old fuddy-duddy. You just don't get what it is I'm doing, and then you get into some of this like, well, you just don't. You just need to feel the Agile. Ever seen the Music Man? At the end where he's saying you just need to feel the Brahms. And I get a little frustrated with that. So Reinertsen's at the opposite end of that spectrum. He actually brings in the economics, the statistics, the queuing theory, the math. The concepts of fast feedback. He actually lays out a real theory, and I'm using theory in the good sense. We're at the University of Minnesota, not in the sense of ivory tower theoretical, but actually in having a very strong empirical mathematical model for why Agile works, and in fact why nothing else really works as well and why it's so important. And he does it not just in terms of IT, but in terms of all of product development. And he brings in the concepts of lean, and he shows where lean gets misapplied with, bringing in concerns like efficiency prematurely. Well, maybe you're not looking at efficiency, but you have to understand it in terms of the particular statistical distributions and what it is you're trying to do when you're inventing product. Now, this is a whole talk in and of itself, but basically, if you're trying to sort out what Agile's about and you're having perhaps some, maybe not completely effective interactions with Agile people, I recommend that book to you unreservedly. It will change your understanding of what it is they're trying to do and perhaps put you in a position where you can give better guidance on what it is they're trying to do because you've actually started to see the theory. I have taken that book strongly to heart in my work in the developing the Agile perspectives for the IT4IT work stream. There are some points here, that I just making to the in terms of positioning IT4IT because of course the Agile community is a little bit suspicious of standards and frameworks, but they like design patterns, and I think that's one of the strongest value points of IT4IT. Is going to be as a set of design patterns that you might think about. I mean, no one's going to come in and pull out the IT4IT architecture and say, your organization has to do this. Well, maybe your leadership would. But if it's generative, if it gives you some interesting things to think about, how is that a bad thing? And so some of the key goals that we had looking at Agile, certainly the centrality of version control. Version control really is the pivot on what the modern IT organization is going to hinge. And Agile, that's a key learning of Agile. Automation is absolutely essential, and how is that a bad thing? Of course we want to automate this stuff as much as we can. A lot of IT dysfunction can be attributed to the fact that we have been under-automating IT. Well, that gets back to why I got interested in ERP for IT to begin with, and so they're doing it. They're doing it at the code and delivery packaging level. This would all be a much longer talk, and I am cognizant of the time. It's nice that there's a clock back there. But essentially, I think that it's essential to understand the cues. It's essential to enable fast feedback. And there is an industry consensus set of components that we're starting to see in DevOps. So as we look at the Agile scenario in IT4IT, you see that there is there's concern for source control, there's concern for build management, there's concern for release design, which is the name of our component, but is essentially what would be recognized by the Agile community as package management. You have the automated testing, you have the flow from test into defect. You have, when you deploy, you have the need to integrate event management, incident management, change control, deployment management for both, and the ability to detect atypical situations in the target system, and to be able to automatically roll back and register that rollback with the change, approve it and register it with the change control component. I mean, it's this is just one more piece of the architecture, but it's expressing it towards this agile use case. The queuing side is the other piece. We did three things. We did portfolio management, we did DevOps toolchain, and we did kanban and queuing. I'm not here to talk about the portfolio management work. Sue actually did that. Kanban is another. I mean, how many of you is Kanban is becoming something a key topic in your IT organizations? Kanban is very, very interesting and very, very disruptive, and I don't think that it's well understood how disruptive Kanban is. It's not just a whiteboard with some columns on it, whiteboard columns, sticky notes. It's a whole philosophy that is running counter to the over-specified process architecture we've been dealing with. The fundamental, and I can show you, YouTube videos. I've multiple sources for this. I think this is an emerging trend in the IT industry. From the point of view of an IT individual contributor, I don't care if it's a change, an incident, a problem, a service request, a defect, an issue, a risk, an action item. You IT process gurus have overspecified that whole landscape to the point where I've got no prioritization. I never know what I should do next. I've got multiple processes firing at me. I've got multiple queues firing at me. I just want one whiteboard and a sticky note, and when the sticky note moves from here to here, I'm going to work on it until it's done. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm done with having to log into half a dozen different systems to get my work done every day. And I thought the whole point of cross-functional process management was to get past that kind of siloing, but it seems like it's popped up again. And so the Kanban movement is, I think, very much about this core execution, this core matter of we have limited time, we have limited attention, we have limited resource, and people are multitasking. We know that human beings are more effective when they are single-threaded. They're able to get into flow. They're able to get into a zone. When you have people who have that kind of an environment, it shows up on your bottom line. They're more creative. They're more effective. So how do we start to understand what it is we've done to ourselves? Well, I mean, this is, looking at the IT4IT reference architecture, this is one of the, I think, most significant pieces of work we're attempting is we need to start understanding wherever there's an implicit queue across all these components and start looking at ways that the demand and the execution in these queues can be brought together into common views and ultimately turned into some kind of a logical Kanban execution concept so that we don't have these multiple channels of demand firing at people, which would basically, queuing theory would tell you, somebody with a background in queuing theory would say, of course that doesn't work. Of course, having one server serve multiple queues, a bad idea from the get-go. A lot of it is we just don't even understand the demand we're imposing on our IT staff. And I think this to me is actually the real beginning of ERP for IT, the ERP for IT journey that some of us have been on for a number of years. I don't know really where it's going to go, but it's definitely kind of where my head is at personally. So a couple more slides, and I think we'll have time for a couple questions. So benefits to standards participation. So obviously, companies that sell IT management software have skin in the game because, hey, we want to be relevant to the market, and if the standard is going to be relevant, then so HP and BMC and CA are, obviously, and IBM are going to have some incentives to participate in this. What's the incentive for companies and smaller companies or customer companies? Well, certainly you see, if there are those of you who are consultants, and you may be here because, okay, this is something that I can start consulting on, and that's a great reason to get involved too, to be involved in the standard and actually contributing to it. There's, not many better ways to have credibility if you're going to go out in the market and talk about the standard, right? Certainly, if you if you're in large IT organizations and you want your people to understand the cutting edge thinking, that also is an incentive here. Now, I believe that people, and I've experienced this myself, people get to a certain point in their career where large conferences maybe are not the best way for them to move forward and gain professional expertise. And so I think there's a lot to be said for standards participation as HR staff development. I mean, I do this instead of, going to training, and I'm learning as much or more by doing this. So that might be an angle to, pursue if you're wondering how to make the business case for your own personal participation in this. So open group's a consortium model. Your company needs to join the open group as an entity. There's no upper or lower bound on size. An LLC of one is a legitimate, corporate company who can join. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alan. Right? Yeah. If you're not ready to go there, there is a LinkedIn group where questions can be discussed. We're starting to see a little more activity there, but now always welcome further discussion. Obviously, there's a lot with this is also how Archimate and TOGAF work. And if you're a gold member of the open group, you can be active in any of the forum. You can be active both in TOGAF and in Archimate and in IT4IT, or you can take out individual silver memberships in each forum. So that would be the basics of the message, and we have 3 minutes for questions. Yes.
You said that IT4IT is meant to be more prescriptive than ITIL and COBIT and other frameworks. But you're at version, I think, 1.2 so far. Are you yet seeing the challenges of trying to be prescriptive and descriptive at the attribute level when you've got COTS software, custom software, open proprietary, mid-range, mainframe, cloud-based,
right,
where the attributes are, what's significant to a component is wildly different, may not even have applicability.
Yes.
Then you've got vendor variations. What's significant in a Microsoft component has nothing at all to, and so on.
Right.
Are you hitting that pain yet?
No, and I don't think we will, because one of the distinctions that I've been very focused on or been very emphatic about for a long time is that you have to distinguish between platform independent versus platform dependent concerns in IT management. And the platform dependent concerns are where you see that platform variability. I mean, if you want to do source control on the mainframe, you need something that understands that environment. If you want to do element management, element configuration management on a mobile device, you need something that understands that. And you're not, but on the other hand, portfolio change incident project request problem incident, those should not vary. I mean, that's been the promise of frameworks like ITIL is that they are platform independent. And so we're going to, I think, continue to maintain a strong boundary of what are the legitimate business of IT platform independent concerns, and where it gets platform specific, we're going to defer that group to the appropriate consortia that operate in those platform standards. Good question. Further discussion? Go.
Some of this stuff could be also done in the Association for Enterprise Architects environment as well. That's where individuals can be members, and people who are TOGAF or OCI certified automatically gets membership status. But so, for example, we have the Association of Enterprise Architects here in the Twin Cities. So if there was a community of people that wanted to get together and do something, then they could at least do it through our chapter. But there's also like a global, like a website, and there are people that are working on some projects right now. And that might be, if there was a need for individual involvement, that might be one way of getting it going. There's nothing going right now that I know of, but it certainly could be if we wanted to get individuals participating. We've had some discussion about how AEA might be a mechanism. Those discussions are ongoing. Yeah, I'm not sure, but good thought. All right. Well, we are at 20 after. I'll hang around for a few minutes. Thanks all for your attendance and attention. So, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.